Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another installment from our series Straight from the Horse's Mouth. The carbon emissions embodied in a building can be a significant share of its total emissions over its whole life, particularly as energy efficiency improves and the electricity grid decarbonises. But what is the best way to measure embodied carbon? NABERS, National Australian Built Environment Rating System, is developing a new rating tool to measure, compare and certify the embodied carbon footprint of buildings. Ivana Brown, the NABERS sector lead accelerating net zero buildings, presents the embodied emissions tool. Here's a sneak preview.
The first thing we looked at was to understand the problem, like what problem exists in the market, how much of a problem is it, who is it a problem for, and does it make sense for NABERS to kind of be resolving this? We did all that work really collaboratively with a huge amount of stakeholder engagement. So you can see over 200 individuals, 140 organizations, 38 workshops. We kind of tried to read the full kind of realm of the property sector. And we also had an expert panel, Edge Environment, UNSW, and the Footprint Company. Well, embodied emissions is a growing and urgent problem. So these are some stats from the GBCA. In 2019, embodied emissions was estimated to be about 16% of emissions from the property and construction sector. But projecting out to 2050, this could be something like 85%.
Just a refresher on the NABERS market needs that we're evaluating everything against. So the framework needed to be, or the tool needs to be impactful, consistent, collaborative, trusted, streamlined, and meaningful.
Currently, there is little consistency in how we measure embodied emissions. Without standards for comparing buildings, the building and construction industry struggles to set targets, report to investors, or communicate design intent with consultants. With that, let's get started.
Hello, and a very warm welcome back to our webinar series, Straight from the Horse's Mouth, Insights from Experts in 30 Minutes. My name is Nicole Sullivan, Head of Strategy and Impact Australia at thinkstep-anz. I'm your host for the next half an hour. Today, we're joined by Ivana Brown, Sector Lead Accelerating Net Zero Buildings at NABERS, as well as our own Technical Director, Jeff Vickers. It's great to have such a big audience today, and some of you might not know us. So just a couple of words about us. We're passionate about enabling organisations to succeed sustainably, and we help with detailed studies like materiality assessment, green financing, carbon footprinting, and LCA, or more strategic sustainability projects. And we've been doing this for 15 years in Australia and New Zealand. We're very excited to have Ivana Brown here as our guest today. So she works for NABERS as their sector lead, accelerating net zero buildings. Ivana specialises in sustainability across the property and construction sectors. She has worked across both strategic and technical roles to deliver strategic outcomes. She's previously worked for Lend-Lease and state government projects that focus on sustainability in the built environment. So over to you, Ivana. We'd love to hear from you.
Great, thanks, Nicole. Part of my role at NABERS is to lead the development of the NABERS embodied emissions tool. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of an overview of that project today. If you don't already know, we have released a consultation paper. It went out on Monday, and it talks about why NABERS is looking at embodied emissions and how we're proposing to develop a NABERS embodied emissions tool. The tool is essentially to measure, verify, and compare embodied emissions in buildings. It's on our website. It's under publications. There's a link here. But if you just go to nabers.gov.au and then go to link through to publications, you'll find it on there. So just a couple of things I wanted to cover with you today. The process, I'm going to take you through how we kind of got to the consultation paper and then also touch briefly on some of the proposals that are in there. Just a short session today, so I won't go into all the gory details, and we'll kind of try and stick to the highlights. So in terms of the process, just at a really high level, this is kind of what we did. The first thing we looked at was to understand the problem, like what problem exists in the market, how much of a problem is it, who is it a problem for, and does it make sense for NABERS to kind of be resolving this? The next one is articulating the objectives and the market needs. So really kind of setting what we're working towards achieving. And then the last one is testing and refining the proposals to kind of get to what are the 10 proposals listed in our consultation paper. We did all that work really collaboratively with a huge amount of stakeholder engagement. So you can see over 200 individuals, 140 organisations, 38 workshops. We kind of tried to read the full kind of realm of the property sector. And we also had an expert panel, Edge Environment, UNSW, and the Footprint Company. So a lot of what I'll take you through today has been co-designed and informed, and this has been really critical, I guess, to the success of our project. So what is the problem, if you don't already know? Well, embodied emissions is a growing and urgent problem. So these are some stats from the GBCA. In 2019, embodied emissions was estimated to be about 16% of emissions from the property and construction sector. But projecting out to 2050, this could be something like 85%. And that's largely because the grid is greening. Buildings are becoming more efficient. The other thing is that the industry is really fragmented. This is what they told us. It makes everyone who's measuring embodied emissions is doing it in their own way. They're using different data sets, different parts of the building. They're comparing essentially different things. So you can't take two organizations or two buildings' results and kind of compare them. And then the other problem, I guess, that we heard a lot of is that there is varied understanding amongst stakeholders around embodied emissions, and it's complex and costly to measure. So there is a lot of effort for stakeholders to work out how to measure embodied emissions. And so this really brings us to a lot of stakeholders, pretty much all the stakeholders that we spoke to told us that they had a really strong desire for NABERS to develop an embodied emissions tool to create that consistency, to get everybody measuring in the same way. And then project teams, organizations, policymakers can spend less time worrying about what is good, how do I measure it, and they can spend more time kind of focusing on the areas that they're really good at, which is creating the impact. We did this project collaboratively. So we partnered with the GBCA, who worked really closely with us on this. And we also had Meld Studios. They helped us design the industry consultation process, and thinkstep-anz. So Jeff and Nicole were our key technical advisors. So that was the problem. Essentially, yes, there's a problem, and there does make sense for NABERS to kind of come up with a solution for it. So then we came up with our objectives and our principles, 3 kind of key objectives that really define what NABERS wants to achieve out of this. So the first one is to support behaviour change to urgently reduce embodied emissions. So that includes in the design process, in the construction process, but also the procurement of specific materials from specific suppliers, focusing primarily on measurement, verification, benchmarking, and disclosure, which is really at the core of what NABERS does. And then also solving targeted problems now, rather than waiting to solve all problems in embodied carbon. And we can design something to meet our objectives, but we also need to make sure that whatever we design has uptake. So we need to understand what are the needs of the marketplace in order to adopt a NABERS embodied emissions tool. They told us these 6 market needs. So we use the objectives and these market needs to essentially come up with 10 proposals that kind of describe what our tool is. I'm not going to go through how we did that process. Jeff's going to talk to that in a little bit more detail later on, but that's at a high level what the process was. So I'll go through as well kind of a summary of what the proposals are. There's a couple of key areas. So we looked at what scope, what's included or what's excluded. We looked at the calculation method. So how do you go about calculating? What data do you use? Benchmarking, the certification process, and also the last one, which is future development. So we actually, as part of the last one, created a roadmap for future development, which shows how the tool is likely to increase in scope over time so that it increases impact over time, essentially. So those ones have all kind of been flagged. You can see these little icons down here, kind of to be reviewed in future as something that we want to review over time. So going back to tool scope, I'm going to go through tool scope and calculation method with you guys. And if you have any questions about these ones or the other ones, we can talk about them at the end. So in terms of the scope of the tool, what's included, what's excluded. So we're looking at only new buildings and major refurbishments. We're looking at only upfront emissions, which is A1 to A5. This is one where we have kind of flagged to review that in the future. Proposal 3 is emissions from the demolition are excluded. So these are essentially accounted for in the calculation of the previous building. That's to align with international standards. Cold shell is the default scope for what we're looking at. The definition for cold shell is intended to align with what's in Green Star, but it's essentially a bit of an unfinished building. So it's all the structure, it's all the main elements. It doesn't include the finishes, doesn't include the furniture. It doesn't include all the air conditioning in the floor plan. No lighting, no floor finishes, no plasterboard. That's kind of what it means by cold shell. And again, this is one which we have looked at that we want to review in the future. So potentially expanding that over time to include warm shell or even the complete building. The next one is carbon emissions. So carbon emissions will be included, but yeah, another one, there's a lot of other types of indicators that you can include. So water emissions is one of those. And we have flagged this as something that we want to review over time. So potentially including more indicators as time goes on. So that's kind of what's in and what's out in the tool is listed in these 5 proposals, what we're kind of calculating and comparing. And the calculation method, so we have 2 in here. The first one is around emissions data. So what emissions data is allowed? So NABERS will encourage verified product-specific emissions data and will apply conservative defaults when no emissions data is available. So what does that look like in practice? It creates a bit of a hierarchy. So at the top of the list is third-party verified product-specific process LCA data. So that means EPDs, carbon neutral certified products. So published emissions from your climate active product disclosure statements. And then where none of the above are available, NABERS is going to provide a table of emissions factors. These emissions factors will be a conservative estimate, and the intent is that it will be conservative enough that most, if not all, products that have an EPD or a climate active disclosure statement will perform better. It is intended to reward projects that use products that measure and disclose their emissions. Reused materials, this is being entered into the calculator as 0 embodied emissions, plus any emissions generated in repurposing or reuse. So we definitely want to reward that. And then the last one around the calculation method is the treatment of stored biogenic carbon and carbon neutral products. So stored carbon and carbon neutral products will be disclosed on the certificates. It'll be via what we call a carbon removal indicator. That's just a bit of a working title at this point. And they will not be recognised within the star rating on the certificate. So what that looks like, and this is just a concept, this might change. This is just to give you guys a bit of an idea of what that could look like. But on the left-hand side, you would have a star rating. This is your greenhouse gas emissions. It essentially shows how efficient your building is in terms of embodied emissions, and that includes all your fossil fuels. So it doesn't include the stored carbon, stored biogenic carbon, and it doesn't include carbon neutral products. That's not included in that star rating. Then on the right-hand side, the carbon removal indicator or the greenhouse gas removals shows how much stored biogenic carbon is associated with the products in your building and how much is from carbon neutral products. So it shows how much you've compensated for the emissions, the embodied emissions in your buildings. We've done this for a couple of reasons, but I think one of the main ones is just to be really transparent, to allow project teams and policymakers to make their own judgments around the importance of stored biogenic carbon and carbon neutral products for each specific purpose. And that can also evolve and change over time. So it's just, it's transparent, it's flexible, and it does align with the way NABERS works in some of its other rating tools as well. So there's a bit of alignment with some of our existing tools. I might pause there. I won't go over the benchmarking and the certification process at this point in time. All of the stuff that I've talked through here is in our consultation paper in way more detail, including a more detailed description around each of these and the rationale. But I just wanted to cover off the next steps in the timeline. So the consultation paper was released on Monday, and it's expected to close on February 16th. So sometime early in 2023, we'll be publishing the final outcomes, so where we've landed on all the proposals, and we'll be doing tool development all of next year. We are targeting to be piloting a tool in mid-2023, launching in early 2024. And then importantly, we have that roadmap, which means that the tool will evolve and change over time as well. The consultation papers on our website, we would love to hear your feedback, not just what you don't like, but what you like and want us to keep is equally as important. And if you have questions about it, you can reach us. This is the best way to get in touch with us, through our mailbox. I might pass over to Jeff to talk you through some of the analysis that we did and what that process looked like.
All right. So as Ivana said, I want to talk through in a little bit more detail the process that we followed to get to those 10 proposals. And before we got to the 10 proposals, we had 13 questions broken down into 5 categories. So this is a kind of working framework that we used to help guide the process through. So we were interested in how the certification process might work. We were interested in what scope of building elements we wanted to consider. We were interested in how the calculation method might work. We were interested in what kind of underlying data would actually be used. Is it going to be EPD data? Is it going to be process-based lifecycle assessment data, hybrid lifecycle assessment data? Are we going to have a hierarchy? Is it going to be weighting factors? All those sorts of things we were looking at. And then finally, we were looking at how we'd set benchmarks. So, you know, is this building good or bad? Does it just have a 4-star rating or a 5-star rating or whatever? How do we set those benchmarks to be able to choose and decide what's good and bad? And so what I wanted to do today is I really wanted to just drill into the process a little bit more, and I wanted to focus on just one of these questions to take you through the concept. The full technical report that supports the proposals will be available on the NABERS website very soon, and you'll be able to access this in more detail if you really want to. But I'm just going to pick on this one question here first, which is which functional or declared unit will be used. And before I do that, I just want to talk through the process that we went through for each question. So this is the process. We started with a problem statement. So what is the question? What is the issue we're trying to address? We looked at early feedback from the market. So there was a series of workshops and meetings that were run from late last year through the beginning of this year, which provided the market needs that Ivana showed, and I'll bring up on screen in just a moment. We then looked to literature and policy from around the world to see if there's anything we could learn. So there are lots of other countries and organizations looking at embodied carbon in parallel. So what could we learn from what they were doing? We then tried to understand what were the options available. So, you know, what are all the possible things we could do to address that particular problem? We then looked at a review of all the options that we could see against the market needs identified for the NABERS embodied emissions tool. And then we presented a recommendation to stakeholders through workshops to get feedback. The feedback was given both through the workshops themselves and also via questionnaires afterward. We evaluated that, we revised the recommendations, and we presented that back to a pool of stakeholders as well, and to our sort of supporting consultants which are evaluating our work. Just a refresher on the NABERS market needs that we were evaluating everything against. So the framework needed to be, or the tool needs to be impactful, consistent, collaborative, trusted, streamlined, and meaningful. And so if we come back to that particular question that I mentioned, this is the one of 13 that we considered. We were looking at which functional or declared unit should be used. So in lifecycle assessment, one of the core concepts is what are we trying to relate everything to? So one of the classic examples given is, you know, if you go into a public toilet and you want to dry your hands, how do you do that? You know, do you use 10 seconds on a Dyson Airblade? Do you use 20 seconds on a conventional old school, you know, hand dryer? Do you use 2 pulls of a cotton roller towel, 2 paper towels? Do you wipe your hands on your jeans? You know, all of these different things are a way of addressing the need of drying a pair of hands. And so in the context of a building, what are we talking about? Is the building in its entirety? Is it a square meter of floor area? If it is a square meter of floor area, are we talking about gross floor area, including all the common areas and some of the areas you can't use? Or is it net lettable area? Are we talking about per square meter per year to try and account for the longevity of the building? One of the comments that some stakeholders made is that if you focus on just square meters, you might penalize high floor-to-ceiling heights, and you might have lots of squat buildings in the future potentially. I don't know if that's likely, but it was one potential risk that was flagged. So should we be looking at indoor enclosed area, for example, and should it be gross volume or net lettable volume? So these are lots of different things we could consider. We've got a range of feedback from the market talking about different things. It should be net lettable area, it should be gross floor area, it should be per square meter, it should be whatever. But one of the things that did come up quite a lot is that stakeholders were concerned that if we just focused on upfront carbon, which is one of the proposals that Ivana just presented, that and just to clarify, upfront carbon is everything until practical completion of the building. So it's all the initial carbon, the carbon footprint associated with the building products, transporting the building products to site and building the building until it's handed over. So there was a concern that if we just focused on the here and now, that we might neglect the future, and that we might build buildings that were, they had a low upfront carbon footprint in the here and now, but the penalty would be that they had poor durability and we were going to have lots of replacements. And so that was a concern that came up quite often. When we looked at literature and we dug into this reasonably deeply, we found that literature didn't really support that. So a lot of the work that's been done, this concept of early obsolescence and things has come up a lot. And this particular quote kind of summed it up to me. Up for me, which is obsolescence appears to occur in the majority of situations before physical deterioration of the building and its components. This knowledge suggests that the current focus on durability or longevity of the building should be rethought. And that's not to say that we should make buildings only last 10 years. But what it is saying is that we have to be careful with assuming that we know what the future is going to need. And sometimes we just don't know that. Sometimes buildings get replaced just because they're no longer fit for purpose. There's a rezoning of land. There's, it's just the wrong building in the wrong place. And so we need to be careful of the limits to our knowledge. And so that's just something that we found through this process. So just to comment on that. In terms of the review, I don't want to go into huge amounts of detail here, but more just to flag that we had a traffic light system. So in the rows, we had the different NABERS market needs: impactful, consistent, streamlined, collaborative, trusted. And there's just a few bullet points here just describing what that means. In the columns, we had the different options. Should it be per building, per meter squared per year, or per cubic meter? The green ones with the tick means that yes, it met that market need. The red ones with the cross meant no, it didn't. And these sort of orange or amber, or however you want to describe this color, with the question mark means if certain conditions were met, then yes, it could meet the need. And if they weren't met, no, it wouldn't. What you're looking for really here is a sea of green. If we're looking down a column and we're seeing a lot of green, that's probably the one that's going to meet most, if not all, of the principles. If there's no option that has all green, we're looking for one that's just green and the amber traffic light as well. We're trying to eliminate things that don't meet some of the needs. And so if we look at these, we're seeing for per meter squared, we're seeing that sea of green that we're looking for. Per square meter scales relative to the thing the building delivers. It's delivering space, enclosed area. It's consistent. We're using a standard definition. It's easy to implement, and it's widely used internationally. Even though it's not used in Green Start, which is a building for building comparison with the reference building, it's widely used in lots of other tools and in NABERS other programs. The calculations are clear, and it's really easy to communicate because people understand things per square meter. So that was kind of the evaluation that we did. So for each of the options we went through, we did that evaluation. We provided some recommendations. All of those recommendations are analysed in detail in this technical report, which will be available on the NABERS website shortly. The consultation paper is already out, as Ivana mentioned. The 10 proposals are there. This technical annex will come soon. And we encourage you, if you're interested in the detail, to jump into that and have a look and let us know if you have any kind of questions or thoughts. So with that, I'll hand back to Nicole so that we can take a few questions.
We have a whole lot of questions. And so what we're going to do is we're going to try and get through as many as we can. And for those that we can't get to, we will definitely come back following the webinar to be able to share the answers to those questions with you. Ivana, I'm going to go to you with the first one. Could you please provide a high-level overview of what is embodied emissions? Why is it important to measure, and who are the most impacted, such as building owners, landlords, or tenants?
So what are embodied emissions? Nicole, Jeff, feel free to clarify this if you don't get it quite right. But it's all the emissions associated with the building during its lifetime. So it includes all the emissions that go into the materials that go into the building, all of the construction. These are all the life cycle stages. So you can see it has the raw material supply, the transport of the raw materials, the manufacturing of it, transport to site, or your construction emissions. And then it also includes everything that happens in the use stage and end of life. What we've chosen to focus on is the upfront carbon, which is this A1 to A5, but it does include embodied emissions, does actually include all of these emissions throughout its whole lifetime.
Thank you. And while embodied emissions might be much more than carbon, through the process, NABERS decided to focus on upfront carbon specifically. Jeff, we've had a few questions about wanting to understand the difference between how many emissions are in cold shell versus warm shell versus a whole completed building. Could you give us just an estimate of what that might be?
Yeah, it's really hard to be sure because I think there's not been enough work done on building services and fit out and those parts of the building. So it's kind of hard to be really, really sure. But we did do a project together with the GBCA in 2021, which looked at kind of material flow analysis at the Australian level and compared different methods for doing life cycle assessment. So process LCA, hybrid LCA, and another method called input-output LCA. And it gives you a way to kind of ballpark it. And as a kind of thumbsuck, I'd say it's roughly half of the emissions are likely to be in the cold shell. The other half are likely to be in the fit out and all the replacement over the life of the building. It really does depend very much on what the building is. And so if it's a big office tower, it's probably more skewed towards the upfront carbon being more dominant. If it's a building that perhaps has a lighter upfront footprint, then the fit out is going to be more important. So a residential home, you might find your carpets and your paint and all that sort of stuff, and bathroom replacements and kitchen replacements over the life of the building, which can be quite long, can actually add up to be really significant over the life. So it varies a lot, but if you kind of were to really sort of have a gut feel, I'd probably say it's about 50-50.
Can I just add to that as well, Jeff? If you're only looking at upfront carbon, so up to the point that the building is constructed, cold shell is about 80%. Of the emissions. So if you're only looking at upfront as opposed to whole of life, cold shell is actually a huge proportion of the emissions.
While we've got you, Ivana, there are a couple of questions that have come through on, is this just about office buildings or are there more buildings that we're looking at in this?
Yeah, good question. We don't know the answer to that exactly yet. And a lot of that is going to need to be worked out during the benchmarking process. We want to include as many buildings as possible and as many commercial buildings. And by that, I mean non-residential. So we want to include as many as possible, but it comes down to how we can benchmark the buildings. So if we can include a lot of different types of buildings within a single benchmark, then we will include a lot of building types. Those benchmarks, some of the things that we've talked about in terms of those benchmarks might be, we might be able to split it up by tall buildings versus short buildings as an example. Or if we can't do it that way, we might have to do it by sector, which is like office, hospital, retail, that sort of thing. So don't know is the short answer. We need to work that out during tool development, which will happen next year. But ideally, as many as possible. And if not all straight away, then we would definitely expand that over time.
And correct me if I'm wrong, Ivana, but the focus would be on everything apart from detached residential houses in the first instance. So looking at commercial.
Yeah, commercial buildings. Yeah.
What implications does the framework have for addressing embodied emissions from the infrastructure sector?
I think the framework could be equally applied to infrastructure. I think some of the questions are maybe less relevant because we had a big focus through the workshops on things like embodied carbon, which is the greenhouse gases embodied in timber products, for example, which are less relevant in infrastructure. But overall, I think that the same kind of concepts can be applied. And I'd encourage greater standardization across the nation. I think generally speaking, we do need to try to move to a position where we all agree on what the numbers should be and how we should do the calculation. Because I think the challenge that Ivana raised at the beginning is very real, right? Like you give 5 different people a project to calculate emissions for the same project and they come up with 5 different numbers. That's not particularly helpful when you're trying to make comparisons or benchmark anything.
Absolutely, thank you. And one brief final question for each of you. I'd like to know how you would describe stakeholder reactions to the proposals so far. So Ivana from a market perspective and Jess from a technical perspective.
It's been really interesting because at the start of this project, I think Nicole actually told us
I did.
You will never get people to agree, but through the extensive stakeholder engagement that we've done and kind of really understanding the needs and testing and refining those with stakeholders, we have generally so far received quite a lot of agreement and consensus around the proposals within the paper. And in particular, because those proposals in the paper are not meant to be the one true way to measure embodied emissions or to do a life cycle assessment or anything like that. They're actually a specific solution to a specific problem, which is about creating consistency to be able to compare the performance, embodied emissions performance of buildings. And this is the way in which we have proposed to do that. So yeah, the feedback has actually been really positive, and we have received generally a lot of agreement around the proposals with the stakeholders that we've consulted with so far. A lot of the issues kind of being raised are more things that we need to think about during tool development rather than necessarily things that we need to amend the proposals with. And there's a lot of work to do in tool development as well, so a lot of details to work out there.
Jeff, final words?
Yeah, I think I'd echo that just in terms of the degree of stakeholder engagement and support for it. I think when we started this, we were hoping for, if everyone walked away equally offended, then we'd probably be winning type approach, because we knew that we weren't going to achieve absolute consensus. But I've been pleasantly surprised by, how everyone's kind of come together around it. I think one of the things that's been really important is the development of the roadmap. So the roadmap was a concept that came through the consultation to sort of say that, yes, all of your points are valid and there's lots of really good stuff that's been raised, and we can't consider all of it at the beginning. So what we're going to do is we're going to start simple. We're going to try and build, and we're going to then look at, down the track, how do we then bring in some of that complexity and rigor and more stuff to try and, increase the scope of what we're looking at over time. And I think that development was really important for how we're working forward with this, to sort of show that there's a forward trajectory here. It's not just here's a tool and then it's never going to be changed again. Rather here's a tool and we're going to keep working on it over time.
Great, thank you for that. And I'm so sorry we can't get to all the questions. I have so many questions still there, but we will get back to you individually on those. Thank you very much to both of our speakers for today. It's been really insightful and helpful, and hopefully a great launch pad for people to be able to go and connect into that NABERS consultation. And I know NABERS would just love to hear your feedback. Thank you for attending our webinar today. If you enjoyed the webinar, you will find this and other webinars on our website. We're very much looking forward to seeing you next time. Have a great day.